In the words of Mr. Lincoln, and the war came. April 12th, 1861, the Confederates fire in Fort Sumter, outside of Charleston, South Carolina. If you're going to have a Confederate nation, you really had no choice. Um, Fort Sumter sat squarely in probably the best harbor that the South had. You couldn't very well leave a foreign nation dominate your best harbor under any circumstance. Um, and so about 4:30 in the morning, um, the artillery of PGT Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the two nations were at war. Well, nobody was prepared. The South may have been slightly more prepared thanks to John Brown and the reaction to his raid, but in reality, nobody was prepared. Lincoln called for 75,000 troops for 90 days. I guess, like almost everybody in the United States, expecting the war to be over quickly. Pretty big nation. And you've got at least 7 states that have left the Union already. If you stop to think about it, it doesn't make much sense that you could finish a war in 90 days. The South had the same point of view. They believed that one Southern soldier was worth 10 Yankees. Probably not true. And nevertheless, the South expected the war to end quickly also. And so both sides go to war. Now, there was on the Union side the commanding general, a fellow by the name of Winfield Scott. Scott, great soldier, great general, leading general in the Mexican War. He knew what was ahead, and he came up with a plan to use the Union Navy to essentially crush the South. That is, it was called the Anaconda Plan, essentially using the water ways of the South, the deep rivers, the long and deep rivers, simply to steadily encircle the South and kill it. Cut the bridges, burn the crops, defeat the armies where necessary, chop it into pieces, and break the Southern will to wage war. This is a very good plan. In fact, it's pretty much like what is eventually going to happen. Just that it's not going to be executed in one big piece the way Scott expected. Instead, it ended up being enacted in many little teeny tiny pieces. And God knows how many hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed and wounded because we went about the Anaconda Plan piece by piece. But nevertheless, the North had a plan. The South, it would be wrong to say it had a plan except survival. The South was in a good position in one sense, in the fact that it didn't have to win the war. It only had to not lose it. A draw was perfectly fine because then the South would be a free nation. Very much again like America in the American Revolution. Much of the Southern plan is dictated by different generals. And there's not much coordination between these generals because essentially the general-in-chief of the South was Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the South, but who had been a pretty good general at one time himself. And, not a great general, but a sufficient one. And he tended to think that he was more skilled than he actually was. And plus, he had his political duties to take care of in terms of having a Confederate Congress. So what eventually ends up happening is, with the exception of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis is going to interfere hither and yon intermittently in the Southern war effort. And so even for those Southern commanders who had a coherent plan, they didn't know when it was going to be interrupted by Davis. And you can make a fairly strong case. A historian by the name of David Donald back in the 1960s made a very strong case that Jefferson Davis lost the war. I think nowadays that's a little simple, but he certainly had a piece in losing the war for the South. Now, the North had around 21 to 23 million people. The South, counting Slade, had about 7 million people. But again, as I pointed out in the first lecture, in the first video, the topography, the mountains and the rivers and the valleys favored the South quite a bit. And essentially, you could fall back into, as Washington did in the American Revolution, to one position after another, never lose your army and still stay in business and eventually wear the other side down. And that's precisely what happened. Politically, militarily, on the northern side, Abraham Lincoln is an amateur. He's not going to become the Lincoln we know until December of 1862, when there is a disastrous, truly disastrous Union defeat. And then he's finally, I think, going to accept the fact that he's president and, he needs to take firm command. After that, you can only say that the Southern strategy, such as it was, evolved in two different directions. The first was the idea of bringing a large Union army to some kind of standoff, stand up and fight battle and beat them and break the Union will. Probably the largest proponent of that will be Robert E. Lee. Lee gets a lot of credit for his activities in the South. I think nowadays Lee is thought of as not quite as good a general as we used to think of him. And you can make a case that Lee had a major role in losing the war. He had a major role in prolonging the war. Quite a good battlefield tactician. In fact, a rather spectacularly good battlefield tactician. But his desire to bring on a stand-up, knock them down battle wasted Southern lives, and the South didn't exactly have a lot of people to waste. The other strategy which the South had was simply, as I say, not to lose. Hit the North when they weren't looking or when they were weak, take advantage of the problems that any nation has invading another nation, and pretty much make it so miserable that the North just quits. So those were basically the strategies. Joe Johnston is a fellow who is associated with the wear them out and wear them down kind of strategy, although Stonewall Jackson, Lee's great assistant, saw that, yes, you could deliver knockout punches, but you had to pick your spots. And Jackson, although always rated as a very, very, very good general, I think nowadays may be being thought of even more highly. Certainly, we know that once Lee loses Jackson in May of 1863, he never wins another offensive battle. Well, we're going to have a lot of generals and a lot of names. And I think probably the place to start them is the Battle of First Manassas, where we're going to meet not just P.G.T. Beauregard, who did the firing on Fort Sumter, but we're also going to meet Joseph Johnston, at least briefly. Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall gets his name in the Battle of First Manassas, where someone looks at Stonewall and his troops waiting patiently to receive an attack and says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally round the Virginians." We're going to meet a fellow by the name of McDowell, who is going to get one bad break after another in history. And if something could go wrong, if a piece of luck could go against him, it didn't go against him. And we're going to get rid of Winfield Scott because he's so bad, to be truthful with you, that he had to be helped onto a horse. And in those days, people rode horses all the time. He was an old man, and young people want to take political. We're also going to meet that redoubtable General George B. McClellan, who is maybe the greatest technician of the war, certainly, I think, the greatest trainer of the war. He's going to create the Union Army. And then he's going to prove that being able to, put boxes here and supplies here and training schedules there and, do what Baron von Sorbin did in Valley Forge, that may not make you a good battlefield commander. And despite McClellan's many skills in terms of organizing armies, his ability to lead armies, particularly into battle, may leave quite a bit to be desired. And we'll do a lot with Mr. McClellan. So anyway, I look forward to our next video, and good luck, and hope you all are staying healthy and well, and I'll see you with the next video.